Hello everyone, our new raid tier Abyssos Savage has been out for a little over a week now, and with my static having done our re-clears last night, the fights are a bit fresher in my memory, so I wanted to just sit down and talk about these fights a bit, as well as the week 1 experience. I guess we could start by talking about the tank busters first. So all of the tank busters this tier, except the ones from P8 Part 2, all apply a bleed or poison, whatever you want to call it, on your tank. Now, if I remember correctly, it is possible to heal some of these bleeds if they were to use a tank invuln to take both hits of the tank buster, but it's certainly not pleasant to do so, and for some it's just straight up impossible. Now, this does mean that you actually have to do the tank busters the way that they were intended to be done, and I kind of like this. Looking back at some older fights, there were these more special tank busters that required 1 or even 2 tank swaps. Look at Titan Savage for example. His tank buster would hit 3 times. So you have the main tank take the first hit, off tank takes the second, and then you swap back to the main tank for the third one. And you'd probably also have to heal the main tank as well so they could survive this second buster. However, because invulns exist, you would only ever do the tank buster normally if something went wrong in the run or if you fat fingered your invuln. In any other case, you would just time your invuln right to cover all 3 hits and call it a day. So it is quite refreshing to have a tier where you can't really do that. And the way how you can use invulns on the final fight that does not have any of these like special tank swap tank busters was also really cool, because you could use your invuln to cover like follow-up auto attacks as well. So let's then move into the fights. P5 took a lot longer than I think we expected, mainly because we couldn't really figure out one mechanic. It's the one where he jumps around a bunch and then you have to intentionally fail one of the poison puddles to feed him. The feeding aspect of this mechanic is something that we figured out quite quickly, because as soon as you fail one puddle, which it's very easy to fail a puddle, especially during prog, you could see the boss eating the ad that spawns, but we couldn't really figure out who the AoE was going on or what that AoE even was. First we thought it was a healer stack, then we thought it was a tank buster that was like baited by distance or something. There were a fair amount of things that came to mind, but none of them seemed to result in a consistent solution. Now we know that it's a group share baited on the closest person to the puddle, but it was definitely something that we struggled with when we were trying to figure out how it worked. The rest of the fight I think was mostly straightforward. Starts off with showing you how the poison puddles work, you already know how the crystals behave from the normal mode of the fight, and then it builds upon that. Later in the fight there's a new mini puzzle that you need to figure out, where you need to transform one of the crystal AoEs into a poison puddle by dropping your healer stacks on them, but because there are no save spots during that mechanic and hitting a crystal is really easy, we only really needed one pull to figure that one out. Overall, I think the difficulty of the fight was pretty good. Certainly some mechanics that could take a little while to get used to, like the jump mechanics with the follow-up poison puddles, or the 4 crystal explosions where you need to find the correct save spots, whatever that mechanic is called. But I do think it strikes a good balance. It's not too hard, but it still provides a decent challenge. I do feel like the jump mechanic is maybe a bit too punishing. I feel like that is probably the place where most PF groups would struggle the most, as 1 or 2 players getting stunned during the jumps could easily result into a wipe. But maybe we just haven't found a good way to salvage the situation yet, because you could probably over mitigate the AoEs that come from the ads and then live through it like that. But we'll just have to try that if we fail it again. But medic of the fight was really cool, liked how the mechanics worked as well, very fun fight to figure out, all but the poison puddle thing after the jumps. I think that's the only thing that I didn't really enjoy having to try and figure out of this fight, but everything else was very solid and it was a good start to the tier. Moving into P6, this fight was a lot easier for my group to clear. We took a fair amount of pulls less to figure this one out compared to P5, but we did certainly struggle towards the end of the fight. Now, one of the final mechanics, FFXIV, quite an overwhelming one, and I've heard that the PF strat for this one is to just tank albeit. And honestly, looking at the mechanic, I can certainly see why people would want to do that. Luckily enough, as long as my group doesn't have a complete fiesta of a pull, then we shouldn't see that mechanic anymore, as we probably could have skipped it yesterday if we just used a melee LB3, but that's probably not an option for PF, so being able to tank albeit is nice, I guess. Mechanics of the fight were kinda cool, was mostly similar mechanics that were shown before, comboed together as we go later into the fight, and I think that the main difficulty of this fight is the identifying of the save spots where you have the purple tiles that are being switched around and such. But we already know that there are fixed positions for some of them, so I wouldn't be surprised if the other iterations of the mechanic also have fixed positions, and then you don't have to go all galaxy brain trying to see where everything's gonna end up, and you can just look at like 1 or 2 tiles and know where to go, because that's how you can handle I believe like the first 2 times that it shows up, so wouldn't be surprised if it's the same for the rest of the fight. But we'll figure it out as we go along, I guess. Overall, I think the fight was quite alright. Nothing too crazy, and outside of the first cachexia, you can just over-mitigate most mechanics and live through the failed mechanic with a damage down. Just need to make sure you don't hit enrage, but as we get more gear, that will become less and less of an issue as well. Mechanics wise, I think it is a little bit harder than P5, but because you can survive failed mechanics easier in this one, I feel like it's a bit easier than P5 overall, just purely because you can live through it with a damage down, whereas in P5 you're probably going to get one-shot by stuff a lot easier. P7 pretty much hit the expectations that I had for the fight, although those were mostly answered in the second half of the fight. First half was pretty easy to be honest, but once you hit the second half, that is where the fight gets more difficult, and deservedly so, because it's still the third fight in the tier after all. I do feel like they maybe could have made the first half a little bit harder, but I also understand that it is providing you with all of the setup that you need to figure out the last major mechanics. It's a pretty good fight, but I also feel like some of these harder mechanics that come at the end of the fight will get skipped once we get more gear, and then we're left with a fight that isn't all that difficult in my opinion. But I certainly enjoyed it. I've mentioned it before, but I also really like it when we get unconventional arenas, and this one is certainly the most special arena that we've had the fight on. And a fair amount of the mechanics also make good use of the arena, so I'd love to see them include something similar into our next raid tier as well. And then we go into P8. This fight was quite something week 1, as it requires pretty much perfect execution and optimization in order for you to clear it. I've even heard some people went for double clears of P5 through 7 so that they could have extra gear going into P8. If you're wondering how that works, you just have 4 people on their main, 4 on their alt, you clear 5 through 7, then you switch groups, and then you basically have 8 people with double the gear that you would normally have to go into P8. There have also been a lot of groups that switch jobs to a more meta comp to get a little bit of extra DPS as well, and while I can certainly understand why these two things happened, I also don't think that it was necessary. And I'm not just talking out of my ass here, I can just look at my own group. We ran with a warrior, we had the white mage sage healer comp, which is also not considered the strong one, and then we also had someone role swap and lose augmented tombstone pants in the process of that. So we definitely didn't run with a meta comp. And then we also shot ourselves in the foot with losing gear along the way, and we still managed to clear it. It was a hard-fought victory for sure, but I'm very proud that my group was able to do it in the end. However, I do feel like if they're going to make a door boss this difficult, that they might as well give us a checkpoint that lasts for the whole week. The door boss this time around was very hard in terms of the mechanics and in terms of the DPS check, and it was also a really long fight. Our fastest kill of the door boss was only 30 seconds behind on our fastest P5 clear, and if you were to combine the door boss and the second phase of the fight, you get a combined fight time of about 16 minutes. I feel like that's maybe a bit long for a savage fight. But all of that aside, both fights were incredible, and the second phase is probably my favorite fight in the expansion so far. So, the door boss. In terms of mechanics, there was a fair amount of randomness to them, which made handling some variations a bit tricky. So depending on what you got, you could either have a very easy time with the mechanics, or you could be having a very easy time wiping the group, because one mistake would often result in you hitting enrage, during week 1 of course, and it was very easy to make these mistakes. Of course, as time goes on and we get more gear, more mistakes will be tolerated, but for week 1, maybe you could get away with like a damage down on your DPS, but not much more than that. So it added that little bit of extra frustration into progging the fight, as if you got a difficult pattern where it was easy to mess up, then you might have to restart, and if you would have landed on the other side of the coin and gotten an easy pattern, then you might have just cleared. So you need to be knowledgeable of what patterns exist in the fight and how to handle each and every one of them when you do end up getting them. I honestly think that if they added maybe 1 or 2 extra big mechanics to the end of the fight, that it could have easily been the final boss of the tier, and I wouldn't even be mad, because the fight was really good. It was difficult, and with some extra mechanics it could have easily been a standalone fight. However, it does have a second phase, and it's a really cool one as well. For tanks, usually having an edge of the arena boss is fairly boring, as all you really need to do is have aggro, and you don't have to care about facing the boss a certain way or positioning for certain mechanics. This time around, you do need to be very wary of your personal positioning, as the auto attacks of the boss are shared damage AoEs, so you need to be stacked together with your co-tank, and as the group you need to make sure that you're away from the tanks as well. Natural alignment was the one mechanic where, depending on who got the elegant field, it could also be fairly chill to do the mechanic, or your healers might be sweating and having to run all around the place trying to make sure that people catch all of the heals and mitigation. Do understand that our strat for this one was not that amazing, and I've seen some other groups handle the mechanic in a way that would make it much easier on your healers, but it also makes me cleanse my butt cheeks as the positioning seems really precise. But my group will probably adapt a similar strat for that one when we get around to optimizing that phase, as once you get the positioning down, it would make things a lot easier and more consistent. The other big mechanic of this phase is High Concept, which is sort of a mix of Hello World from Omega and then Nisi from the Alexander raids. There's a fair amount of debuffs from Hello World that are making a comeback, and instead of passing around Nisi debuffs, you're now combining them instead. Both versions of the mechanic are really cool to see in action, and especially the second one is just amazing. I think the pacing of the fight is also really good. Like, it feels like it's a short fight, but it's about 8.5 minutes long, which is about as long as P5 Savage, so it's certainly not short, but it doesn't drag. While you do have repeat mechanics like Natural Alignment and High Concept happening twice, and then Dominion happens twice at the end of the fight as well, there are enough unique things about both versions of High Concept and Natural Alignment that it doesn't really feel like a repeat, which when we're looking at Oracle of Darkness, the Apocalypse mechanic was pretty much the same thing 3 times with a tiny bit of added difficulty on top of them for each time it came back. Natural Alignment is maybe coming close to that, but both High Concepts are very unique. The Victory Lap is the same mechanic repeated twice, but it all happens in the span of like a minute, I think it is. So the main focus during Dominion and the Ion cast is going to be more on the mitigation than on the actual mechanic that is going on. Or at least that's how it felt to me. Maybe as a DPS player you might feel different about that. But the fight was still really good. Overall, I really enjoyed the different fights this tier brought. Not a single fight I don't like at this point in time, and while it might have been hell to proc on week 1, especially P8, I think this tier is going to be quite enjoyable as we farm it out for the next few weeks and months, and maybe also do some extra optimization where we feel we need it. Let me know down below how your experience with the tier has been so far, and with that I want to thank you for watching, I want to thank my Patreons for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.